There is a kind of lie that never leaves your mouth. It never becomes a sentence, never becomes sound. It lives deeper than language, a quiet shift in your behavior, a tightening in your chest, a glance away from the truth you don't want to face. It's the lie you learned to tell in childhood. Not to deceive others, to protect yourself. You lied to yourself to survive. Not because you were weak, not because you were dramatic, not because you misunderstood life, but because the truth was too heavy for the version of you that had to carry it. And somewhere along the way, that lie became a part of you. It wrapped itself around your identity, masking the parts of your soul that didn't feel safe enough to exist. You don't even notice it now. You think it's your personality. You think it's your nature. You think it's just who you are. But it's not. It's a survival pattern, a psychological adaptation, a silent agreement you made with yourself when you were too young to know that survival comes with a cost. Maybe the lie sounded like, I don't need anything. I'm fine. I'm not hurt. It doesn't matter. I'm over it. This is normal. This is enough. I don't care. I didn't want that anyway. You took the softest parts of you when the world around you didn't feel safe of you, when the world around you didn't feel safe enough to hold them. So you hid your needs. You buried your longing. You drowned your anger. You silenced your sadness. You softened your opinions. You disguised your intelligence. You played small so you wouldn't be punished. You played strong so you wouldn't be abandoned. This is the tragedy of emotional survival. You learn to lie to yourself before you even understand who you are. And by the time you're old enough to see the lie, you're already living inside it. You call it being independent. You call it not wanting to be a burden. You call it being low maintenance. You call it not getting attached easily. You call it having high standards. You call it being private. But if you slow down, if you sit with the quiet parts of your chest, you'll hear a voice inside you whispering, that's not the truth. The truth is, you learned to silence your desires because expressing them caused pain. You learned to numb your emotions because feeling them was too overwhelming. You learned to pretend you were okay because no one asked if you weren't. You learned to be strong because softness didn't feel safe. You learned to stay quiet because speaking your truth felt dangerous. You learned to love in a way that cost you nothing, because loving honestly cost you everything. You didn't choose these patterns. They were built into you by necessity, by environment, by survival. The child you once were didn't have the luxury of emotional truth, so they created emotional lies that protected them long enough to grow into the person you are now. But here's the thing. Lies that help you survive childhood will destroy you in adulthood. The lie that shielded you now suffocates you. The lie that protected you now imprisons you. The lie that helped you cope now keeps you numb. The lie that kept you safe now keeps you small. You don't realize it, but the friction you feel in your life, the restlessness, the emptiness, the sense that something is missing, it's not failure. It's the soul trying to tell you. If this content making sense to you, subscribe to the channel, and thank you for your support. You're living inside a story that isn't yours anymore. People think suffering comes from lack, from hunger, from the absence of love. But some of the deepest suffering comes from living a life shaped by lies that are no longer necessary. You think you don't want connection, but that's the lie protecting the part of you that was never given enough. You think you don't want to be understood, but that's the lie guarding the child who was never seen. You think you don't need support, but that's the lie hiding the exhaustion you refuse to admit. You think you're too much or not enough, but that's the lie inherited from people who misunderstood your depth. You think you're better alone, But that's the lie you built when closeness became dangerous. You think you're strong because you carry everything. But that's the lie born from growing up with no one to hand anything to. These lies were medicine once, but now they are poison. You're older now, wiser, stronger, more aware, more capable of holding the truth you once had to run from. But the old lie doesn't know that. It only knows how to protect you. And it protects you by pulling you back into the familiar darkness. The same emotional terrain you walked as a child, repeating the same patterns, feeling the same wounds, carrying the same loneliness. You call it just how I am, but it's not how you are. It's how you learned to be. There's a difference, and the moment you feel that difference, even for a second, your entire life starts to shift. Because the lie cannot survive direct contact with truth. It crumbles. It dissolves. It exposes the parts of you buried beneath years of coping. That moment is terrifying. It feels like losing yourself. It feels like something inside you is dying. And in a way, something as the survival self is dying. The self built on adaptation. The self built on silence. The self built on fear. The self built on pleasing. The self built on emotional camouflage. But beneath that self, beneath the practiced quietness, beneath the controlled emotions, beneath the strength you wear like armor, there is another self emerging. The real one, the original one. The one you abandoned to survive. The one your soul has been trying to return you to. The one who knows what they want. The one who feels without apology. The one who loves without shrinking. The one who speaks without fear. The one who trusts their intuition. The one who sets boundaries without guilt. The one who isn't hiding. That version of you isn't afraid of the truth. They're only afraid that you'll never stop lying long enough to meet them begin to crack. Not because you forced it. Not because you're ready. Not because healing arrived on schedule, but because your soul is tired. Tired of pretending. Tired of performing. Tired of carrying the weight of emotions you won't let yourself feel. Tired of building a life around wounds you never chose. Tired of being small so the world doesn't see how much you're carrying. The exhaustion is not weakness. It is the truth, trying to break through the armor. People think the soul speaks through clarity, through insight, through revelation, but the soul speaks first through fatigue. That deep, bone-level wariness that makes it hard to pretend anymore. It's the moment you stop being able to say, I'm fine. I'm okay. It's whatever. I don't care. I'm over it. It's not that those words stop being available to you. You simply stop believing them yourself. And that is the beginning of an unraveling. Not a breakdown. A breakthrough in slow motion. The lies you told yourself to survive begin to feel like clothes that no longer fit. Too tight, too stiff, too small for the person you are quietly becoming. You start noticing the tension, the emotional friction, the sense that something in your life no longer aligns with your inner truth. The persona you crafted feels tired. The mask feels heavy. The old identity feels hollow. This is the dangerous moment, the threshold between who you were and who you must become. It's dangerous because the old lies still feel familiar, and the truth still feels threatening. You know the script of the lie. You know how to perform it. You know how to hide behind it. You know how to disappear into it when the world becomes too much. But the truth is a stranger at your door, unavoidable, uninvited, unrelenting. It asks for everything you've withheld. It asks for the emotions you buried. It asks for the innocence you lost. It asks for the pain you minimized. It asks for the dreams you abandoned. It asks for the version of you who never learned that their needs mattered. Truth is demanding. That's why you avoided it. That's why you lied. You told yourself you were strong, when what you really were was unsupported. You told yourself you didn't care, because caring felt dangerous. You told yourself you were over it, because grieving felt impossible. You told yourself it didn't hurt, because the pain was too big to hold. You told yourself you didn't need anyone, because needing someone who could not show up was a wound you could not survive twice. These lies weren't delusions. They were armor. But armor that becomes permanent turns into a tomb. And the longer you live inside that tomb, the more you forget that you were not born to live in darkness. You were born to feel, to desire, to hope, to ache, to risk, to ask for more, to hold love and loss and longing with the full weight of your humanity. But emotional truth feels unfamiliar when you've spent years shaping your identity around what you thought you had to be in order to survive the environment you came from. People don't realize this survival isn't just physical. The psyche also learns to survive emotionally by distorting reality just enough to make the pain bearable. You lied to yourself because the truth, back then, would have shattered you. You lied to yourself because no one taught you how to hold your own feelings. You lied to yourself because you didn't have the strength, the language, or the safety to confront the world as it really was. You lied because you were alone with truths that children should never have to carry. So you silenced parts of your soul, the parts that cried, the parts that hoped, the parts that trusted, the parts that needed tenderness, the parts that knew the difference between love and fear. You learned to numb. You learned to disappear. You learned to detach from the self that felt too vulnerable to protect. And now, as an adult,
those same lies still run your life, long after the danger has passed. That is the tragedy of survival. Your trauma becomes your personality. You stop knowing where the lie ends and where you begin. You think your detachment is just how you are. You think your silence is just your temperament. You think your boundedness is just your boundaries. You think your numbness is just adulthood. But none of that is you. It's protection. And protection is not the same as identity. There's a moment, eventually, when something inside you whispers, "I don't want to live this way anymore." You don't shout it. You don't announce it. You barely admit it. But the whisper is enough. It's enough to shake the foundations of the lies. It's enough to awaken the parts of you buried in the dark. It's enough to remind your soul that it was never meant to live in a cage built from childhood fear. But here's the part no one warns you about. When the lie begins to die, the truth hurts at first, not because it's painful, but because it's real. Reality feels violent when you've been living in distortion. Honesty feels foreign when you've been loyal to avoidance. Your own emotions feel unbearable when you've been suppressing them for years. This is why you hesitate. This is why you sabotage. This is why you return to the lie even when it's killing you. Because the lie is familiar. The truth is a stranger. But the stranger is compassionate. The stranger is patient. The stranger is you. The you who never got to grow. The you who never got to speak. The you who never got to want. The you who never got to trust. The you who never learned how to stand without abandoning themselves. That version of you is still waiting, not with anger, not with judgment, but with a quiet longing to finally be held. The lie protected the child, but the truth is the only thing that can free the adult. And as the truth begins to rise in you, as it pushes through the cracks in the persona, as it dissolves the numbness, as it burns through the armor you've worn for decades, you start to remember something. You were never weak. You were never dramatic. You were never broken. You were never unworthy. You were surviving, and you did it well. But survival is not living. And the lie that once saved you is now the very thing keeping you from becoming who you are. That realization is devastating, but it is also liberating. Because the moment you see the lie, you can no longer unsee it. You can no longer live inside it comfortably. You can no longer hide behind it without feeling the weight of your own truth pressing against your ribs. The lie begins to crumble, not with rage, but with recognition. And beneath the ruins, you begin to sense the quiet pulse of something you thought you lost, your real self. The child you abandoned to survive is still there, waiting for you to stop abandoning yourself. There's a point in the unraveling, a quiet threshold, where the lie begins to surrender. Not because you forced it, not because you healed, but because the truth finally gained enough strength to stand on its own. You don't announce this moment. You don't even recognize it when it arrives. It happens in tiny shifts, small cracks in the practiced performance. You pause before saying, "I'm fine." You hesitate before swallowing your feelings. You feel something rise in your chest when you try to pretend you don't care. Your voice shakes when you want to speak the truth, even if the words never make it out. These are not failures. They are awakenings. The lie is losing its grip. Not because it was weak, but because you've finally grown strong enough to hold what it was protecting you from. This is the part people misunderstand. Healing doesn't feel like healing. It feels like breaking. It feels like confusion. It feels like grief. It feels like losing identities you've worn for years. It feels like saying goodbye to versions of yourself you never wanted to be, but depended on to survive. You feel torn between two worlds, the self you constructed and the self that survived the construction. You find yourself mourning things you never let yourself want. You grieve relationships you never truly had. You ache for needs you pretended didn't exist. You long for a softness you convinced yourself you didn't deserve. The truth is not gentle at first. It arrives like a flood, breaking open the chambers where your real emotions have been held hostage. Anger rises, not to destroy, but because for the first time, it finally has permission to speak. Sadness surfaces, not because you are weak, but because numbness is no longer enough to keep the pain contained. Loneliness hits, not because you are unlovable, but because you finally stopped lying to yourself about how much you needed connection. Grief pours out, not because you are broken, but because you can finally feel the cost of everything you had to silence to survive.
If this content making sense to you, subscribe to the channel, and thank you for your support.
This is the moment where most people turn back. They run to the lie, to the old self, to the familiar patterns that feel safer than the truth. But you're different. Something in you refuses to go back. Not because you're fearless, but because you can no longer pretend that the lie feels like home. You know too much now. You've seen too far. You've felt the tremble of your real self waking up. And once the soul begins to rise, you cannot force it back to sleep. So you keep going. You feel the anger, You feel the grief. You feel the emptiness. You feel the longing. You feel the truth. You let it move through you without collapsing under its weight. Because now you understand, these feelings are not here to punish you. They are here to return you to yourself. Every tear, every ache, every trembling moment of honesty pulls you closer to the you who never got to exist. Because survival didn't leave room for authenticity. This is the paradox of healing. You become whole by meeting the parts of yourself you once feared the most. And slowly, almost impossibly, something begins to shift. You start recognizing yourself in new ways. Not the self you performed. Not the self shaped by old expectations. Not the self defined by wounds. A deeper self. A truer self. A self who looks at life differently. A self who no longer needs to hide behind strength. A self who isn't afraid to feel deeply. A self who can sit with discomfort without crumbling. A self who doesn't abandon themselves just to keep the peace around them. You begin to sense that you've stepped out of the lie and into a new kind of honesty. One that feels like standing barefoot on the soil of your own soul for the first time. It's unfamiliar, but it's real. And realness, after a lifetime of masks, feels like breathing. It's not perfect. It's not constant. It's not smooth. But it is yours. And in that honesty, something miraculous begins to happen. You start to trust yourself. Not the self shaped by fear, but the self shaped by truth. You trust your intuition. You trust your emotions. You trust your voice. You trust your boundaries. You trust your deep needs. You trust your capacity to hold yourself. The lie taught you to doubt. The truth teaches you to trust. You look back and realize the lie kept you alive, but it also kept you invisible, even to yourself. You see now that the lie was never the enemy. It was a temporary shelter, a coping mechanism, a psychological bandage created by a child who had no other way to protect themselves. And you honor that child. You thank them. You acknowledge the strength it took to survive with so little. But you also understand that the adult you are now can no longer live under the rules of a frightened child. The soil that once protected you has become too tight for your roots. The mask that once saved you is now suffocating you. The lie that once carried you is now collapsing under the weight of your becoming. So you step out. Not in a dramatic declaration, but in a slow, deliberate, honest unfolding. You stop saying, "I'm fine," when your chest is full of storms. "I'm over it," when the wound still bleeds. You stop saying, "I don't need anyone," when you crave connection in the deepest parts of your soul. You stop saying, "I'm strong," when what you really are is tired of being unheld. This is the rebirth. Not the glamorous kind, not the triumphant kind, the real kind, the quiet, painful, liberating kind. You reclaim the parts of yourself you once abandoned. You gather the emotions that were too heavy for the child you were. You listen to the truths you once silenced. Then slowly the survival self steps aside, not destroyed, not erased, but honored and relieved. Because now you can finally carry what they could not. You become the protector you always needed. You become the truth teller you once feared. You become the self you lied to yourself about for so many years. And in that becoming, in that raw, trembling honesty, you find something the lie could never give you yourself, the real one, the one who can finally say, I survived. But now, I want to live.